everyone, welcome back to Carrie's Corner, where we are continuing the Pushcart War by Jean Merrill, illustrated by Ronnie Solbert. So we're starting in the middle of this chapter. Having lived by this motto for so long, Mr. Jerusalem was not happy about the pea shooter campaign. To be sure, he had a great deal more at stake than the other peddlers. In his case, it was not only his business, but his home that was in danger as long as the trucks continued to attack the pushcarts. Still, it went against his deepest convictions to cause another man trouble. "There are enough troubles in the world," he had said to himself as he worked alongside the other peddlers, putting pins in the peas. "Why should I make more?" Mr. Jerusalem was still asking himself this question as he set down off Delancey Street on the morning of March 23rd. Like the other peddlers, Mr. Jerusalem was fully armed, although no one walking down the street would have noticed. Anyone glancing at Mr. Jerusalem would have taken the yellow plastic straw sticking from his coat pocket for a yellow pencil, and no one would have taken any notice at all of the 24 peas with a pin stuck carefully through the center of each, which Mr. Jerusalem had pinned to the sleeve of his jacket. Or even if someone had noticed, he would have supposed that Mr. Jerusalem had 24 tiny sleeve buttons on his jacket. Mr. Jerusalem's clothes never looked like anyone else's anyway. He picked them up here and there secondhand, and he had his own style of wearing them. "A sleeve full of ammunition," Mr. Jerusalem muttered to himself as he set off on the morning of March 23rd to pick up a second-hand popcorn machine that he had arranged to buy. "Who would believe it? A man my age going to war." Mr. Jerusalem shook his head sadly. "I can hardly believe it myself. Fighting in the streets," he continued. "A man of peace for 80 years is walking fully armed down Delancey Street. A man who does not care for fighting. It's not only that I do not care for fighting," he went on. "Naturally, I do not care for fighting," he admitted. "But it is also that fighting a 10-ton truck with a pea shooter is a little crazy. I do not think it will work. But what else can we do?" he asked himself. He could not think of anything else. "So I will fight," he said, "if I have to," he added. All the same, Mr. Jerusalem was relieved when at 10 o'clock, the hour the attack was to begin, there was no truck parked within 100 feet of his cart. Mr. Jerusalem did not think he could hit the tire of a moving truck. "Would General Anna want me to waste the ammunition?" he asked himself. "Or Maxie Hammerman, or Miss Wenda Gambling, who's been so kind as to pay for 1 ton of pins, not to mention peas?" When Mr. Jerusalem arrived at the candy store where he was to pick up the popcorn machine, he parked his cart. He was just starting into the store when someone shouted at him. Mr. Jerusalem looked around and saw a leaping lima. The driver of the leaping lima was trying to back into a space in front of Mr. Jerusalem's cart. The truck was loaded with new glass and chromium popcorn machines. Now, if there was any kind of truck that Mr. Jerusalem did not like, it was a leaping lima. The reason for this was that Mr. Jerusalem had known Louis Livergreen's father. Louis's father had been, before his death, one of the most respected pushcart peddlers in the second-hand clothesline. Mr. Jerusalem had often made a cup of tea on his charcoal burner for Solomon Livergreen when he and Solomon were working on the same street. Mr. Jerusalem should have been glad that Solomon's son was a big success. People said Louis Livergreen now owned 100 big trucks. But Mr. Jerusalem held it against Louis Livergreen that from the day Louis had got his first truck, he had never come to see his father again. So every time Mr. Jerusalem saw a leaping lima on the streets, he thought, "They are breaking up family life." As he watched the leaping lima backing into the curb on the first day of the pea shooter campaign, Mr. Jerusalem wondered what his old friend Solomon Livergreen would have thought of the Pushcart War. Would Solomon, he wondered, have shot at a truck belonging to his own son, Louis Livergreen? And what would Solomon have wished his old friend, Mr. Jerusalem, to do? "Shoot if you have to." This is what Solomon Livergreen would say, Mr. Jerusalem said to himself. Mr. Jerusalem's conversation with Solomon Livergreen was interrupted by the driver of the leaping lima. "Hey, Bud!" shouted the driver. "Stop talking to yourself and move the baby buggy." The driver was Little Milty, a driver mentioned in the diary of Joe Cathlis. Mr. Jerusalem frowned. It was bad enough that Little Milty, a man 1/2 the age of Mr. Jerusalem and not as tall, should call Mr. Jerusalem Bud, but that Little Milty should call Mr. Jerusalem's cart, which was also his home, a baby buggy, this was unnecessarily rude. However, Mr. Jerusalem answered courteously. "I will only be a minute," he said. "I can't wait a minute," said little Milty. "I got to deliver a popcorn machine." "Well," said Mr. Jerusalem, "I have to pick up a popcorn machine. Until I pick up this second-hand popcorn machine, there'll be no room in the store for a new machine such as you wish to deliver." And he turned to go about his business. But as Mr. Jerusalem started into the candy store, little Milty raced his motor. Mr. Jerusalem hesitated. He remembered what had happened to Morris the florist. He glanced over his shoulder. "I'm backing up, bud," little Milty said. Mr. Jerusalem sighed and walked back to move his cart to the other side of the street. Little Milty grinned. "That's a good boy, Buster." Mr. Jerusalem did not reply. But as little Milty was backing into the place Mr. Jerusalem had left, the old peddler took out his pea shooter. He looked at it doubtfully. "A man my age with a pea shooter," he sighed. Such craziness on Delancey Street. However, he inserted one of the pea pins, took careful aim, and fired. For a moment nothing happened. Mr. Jerusalem felt foolish. "All right," I admitted, he said. "We are all crazy." Mr. Jerusalem was about to drop his pea shooter in the gutter when he heard a slight hissing sound, the sound of air escaping from a tire. "Or perhaps not so crazy," said Mr. Jerusalem. He put the pea shooter back in his pocket and went to collect the popcorn machine. When he came out of the candy store, one of little Milty's rear tires was quite flat. Little Milty was stamping up and down in the street and speaking even more rudely to the tire than he had spoken to Mr. Jerusalem. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Jerusalem. "The leaping llama is not leaping so good. A little trouble, maybe?" But little Milty was too angry to reply. "Believe me, Solomon, I had to do it," Mr. Jerusalem said, as if to his old friend Solomon Livergreen. "The fact is, Solomon," he continued, as he roped the popcorn machine onto his cart, "to cause a little trouble now and then is maybe good for a man. But Solomon," he asked as he set off down Delancey Street, "who would have thought a man my age would be such a good shot? Naturally, it pays to use high-quality pins," he added. Although Mr. Jerusalem knew where he could get a good price for the second-hand popcorn machine, he was now in no hurry to get there. He paused to look over every truck that had stopped for a traffic light or had pulled up a curb to make a delivery. Mr. Jerusalem chose his targets very carefully. And, to his astonishment, he hit 4 more trucks before he ran out of ammunition. At 2:30 in the afternoon, he headed back to Maxie Hammerman's for more pea pins. He still had not got around to selling his popcorn machine. Chapter 13, Maxie Hammerman's Battle Plan and General Anna's Hester Street Strategy. There's the beginning of that chapter with headlines from newspapers. We're just going to read a little bit into this chapter. Although Mr. Jerusalem was no more than half a mile from Maxie Hammerman's shop when he ran out of ammunition, it took him nearly 3 hours to get there, for by mid-afternoon the city was a mess. In the Delancey Street area, things were particularly bad. In every block, Mr. Jerusalem saw 2 or 3 trucks stranded. Traffic was at a standstill, and people were shouting at the truck drivers for blocking the streets. The truck drivers were furious. They were not used. Oh, wow, look at all those trucks. That's quite the illustration, all stuck in the streets. They were not used to being honked at and shouted at, and they had no idea what was happening to them. The first few trucks who were hit thought they had had the bad luck to pick up a splinter of glass or a nail. They telephoned for garage mechanics to come and help them change their flats, and went to have some coffee while they waited for the mechanics. The truck drivers did not realize that their troubles were anything out of the ordinary until the mechanics began to sound irritated with them. Around noon, the mechanics began to snap at the truck drivers who called for emergency service. "Hold your horses, buddy," more than one driver was told. "I got 14 flats ahead of you, and you just gotta have to wait until tomorrow." At that point, the truck drivers began to wonder. Most of the stalled trucks were so big that a truck driver by himself could not possibly change a tire. So a driver had little choice but to sit with his truck and wait for help, getting crosser and crosser as the day wore on. Mr. Jerusalem was impressed that the afternoon papers were already warning motorists that Delancey Street was a disaster area, and there were terrible tie-ups in other parts of the city. It was 5:30 before Mr. Jerusalem could get his cart through the tangled traffic to Maxie Hammerman's shop. In many streets, pushcarts were the only vehicles that were getting through at all. By the time Mr. Jerusalem did get to Maxie's, Maxie had an enormous street map of New York City tacked on his wall. As the peddlers came in to report, Maxie had been sticking pea pins in the streets where truck tires had been hit. These pea pins had been painted a bright red so that no one could see at a glance how the battle was going. So that one could see at a glance how the battle was going. There were a few gold pea pins scattered among the red. Max explained that these were for the really big hits, such as trailer trucks or mighty mammoths or 10-ton tigers. Or leaping llamas? Asked Mr. Jerusalem. If you got a llama, I'll give you a gold, said Maxie. The map was already peppered with red and gold pea pins. Mr. Jerusalem studied the map with pleasure. The battle looked very neat and well organized on Maxie's map. That's where we're going to stop, and there's a picture of his map. We will continue next week. And I'm going to read only a couple times next week. So stay tuned. I think there'll be one on Monday. See you then. Have a great weekend doing all sorts of fun things. Bye. Bye, says Froggy. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.